Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another Sew with Poe. I'm Rachel Poe, program developer at Conner Prairie, and it's really good to see you. I'm glad you could stop by today. We're going to talk about hexagon quilting, English paper piecing, and do a little project that will hopefully get you excited to make something a little bit bigger. We're going to start off with some history, some facts, do a little bit of math, don't worry, it's not too much, and then we'll get to that project. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a finished quilt that I can show you here at my house, but I have a lot of lovely coworkers who've worked on projects that use this technique, and they've provided some pictures of their works in progress along with the finished product. So take a look. You might even recognize some of these pieces from Conner Prairie if you've ever been to the Campbell house while we're working on the quilt, either piecing it together or actually quilting it.
Aren't they beautiful? You can see that there are a variety of ways to position the hexagons so that it looks like a diamond or a flower. In fact, you may have seen this pattern called Grandmother's Garden because of the way it resembles flowers. You can have a neutral fabric between the flowers or diamonds so that your fashion fabrics really stand out. You can also just have a randomized pattern of hexagons, like this. You'll also notice that there's a variety in the sizes of hexagons from quilt to quilt. You can choose any size you want, but they all must be the same. We'll talk about why in a bit. You may also notice that there's a pretty wide variety in terms of fabric. You can have just a few that fit a theme like this baby quilt, or it's a great scrap buster if you've got lots of little bits of fabric left from previous projects.
In fact, that's historically what was used for a project like this. When you make clothes, you have to cut pieces out of fabric that aren't always rectangles, and then you end up with smaller, more oddly shaped pieces of fabric. Now, you could take these scraps and use them in your quilt. You were making sure the fabric didn't go to waste, and it also created something like a memory quilt. You could look at the pieces and remember, oh, that was the dress that I wore when I was younger, or oh, I remember when Father had a shirt made out of that fabric. Another way that quilters of the past were resourceful was when it came to paper. Now, in 1830 Massachusetts, a quire of paper, which is only about 24 or 25 sheets, cost 24 cents. Now, if we adjust that for inflation to today's money, that means that this same quire of paper would cost $7. That means a single sheet of paper would cost 28 or 29 cents. That's expensive. So it makes sense that people wouldn't want to cut up their brand new beautiful pieces of paper to put them in their quilt. However, there was a source of paper that they could use. Friends and family would often write letters, and once you received that paper, if it was written on all sides, guess what? Snip, snip, in it goes. Waste not, want not. Now, paper is important because we are going to be using it to make sure that all of the pieces of our fabric are the same size and shape. Now, this technique is called English paper piecing, and this technique began as early as the 1770s, and it was first published in America in the Godey's Ladies' Book in 1835. Of course, the technique probably traveled with people from England to America before that, and we know that's true because there is an example of a quilt made in English paper piecing style in America that is dated to 1807. So how does it work? You use the paper pieces to stabilize your fabric by basting the fabric to the paper, and this allows you to be very precise with your seams. In 1836 Prairietown, they didn't have sewing machines there yet, so this was very helpful. And even with a modern sewing machine, a hexagon quilting pattern is much more difficult than a quilt with square or rectangle blocks, and it requires a lot of precision in cutting, marking, and sewing. So, we've talked about why we use fabric in this way, we've talked about why we use paper, and now I'm going to talk about why we use hexagons. Warning, here be math. Tessellation. Tessellation is when you fill a flat surface with polygons or multi-sided shapes. Sometimes tessellation uses multiple shapes to fill the space.
If you've ever played with these blocks to make patterns and pictures, you've tessellated shapes. Sometimes you can use a single shape to fill up the whole space. Artist M.C. Escher was super good at this. I mean, these lizards are pretty amazing. Some other shapes like diamonds also work. Check out this quilt by my friend and coworker, Jenny.
You can also use one of 3 regular polygons to self-tessellate, or tessellate with a single shape and no gaps. A regular polygon is a shape that has all the sides the same length and every interior angle is also the same. Guess what? Hexagons are one of them.
Bees are super smart and use hexagons to make their honeycomb. Squares are another self-tessellating shape. You can see what I mean when I take these paper squares and put them together. Every corner touches a corner, and every side touches a side. There aren't any holes to fill up. If you tried the same thing with an octagon, which has 8 sides, it would look like this. See the square-shaped places? Not self-tessellating. I'll let you figure out what the third regular polygon besides squares and hexagons is that would work for self-tessellation.
All right, so we've talked about history and we've gotten the math out of the way. It's time to start sewing. We're gonna make 2 hexagon flowers, which will total 14 hexagons. And we're gonna use these to make a pincushion as our first project. And as a bonus, when you get done, you'll have something that is beautiful, that is handmade, and useful.
First thing is always supplies. You will need needle, thread, scissors, both fabric and non-fabric if that matters to you, paper, fabric, some light cardboard, a ruler or guide for your hexagons, a pencil for tracing hexagons on paper, and a marker for tracing hexagons on fabric. You'll also need something to stuff your pincushion like old pillow stuffing, fabric scraps, or wool. You may notice that I'll be using some very small scissors. Those are my embroidery scissors, and they are made for cutting small things like thread, but not usually big things like paper. I attach mine to my clothes with a white ribbon so I don't misplace them. If you have nail scissors from a manicure kit, those would work too.
One of the most important parts about English paper piecing is the paper. For this project, you are going to be cutting out 14 identical hexagons, and I'm going to use paper hexagons that are about 1.5 inches tall from flat side to flat side. That means that each side is about 7/8 of an inch long, and it is 1 3/4 inches from point to point. You can make your hexagons that same size. You can make them a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. It will just adjust the size of your pincushion. It's really up to you. You can find templates online and print them out. Unfortunately, the printer that we have here at my house seems to think that I want everything printed in invisible ink. Not helpful, printer. But luckily, I have this really cool hexagon measure. See, I hope you can kind of see it there, that I found at a craft store. It's amazing. And so I used this to help me make this cardboard template. So I can use it to trace on the paper. In fact, I even marked it with a P so that I know this is my paper size. I also made another one that's slightly larger, that I marked with an F for fabric.
I put it on the paper, trace, move, trace, move, trace, move, trace, move, and so on and so forth until I will have 14 hexagons. Because hexagons can self-tessellate, you can save time by sharing sides like this. If you want something more sturdy than regular paper, index cards will work. Just keep in mind that the thicker the paper, the more force you'll have to use to get your needle through it later.
Once you've got your paper hexagons cut, you'll need to cut out your fabric hexagons too. You're going to want to leave a seam allowance of 1/4 to 1/2 inch on all sides. You can create another template that's the size of your paper hexagons plus that seam allowance on every side, and then trace that around that on your fabric. Now, if you're feeling a little brave, you can use the template for your paper hexagons and just leave that margin when you're tracing it on your fabric. However, if you're not too sure, you can always just leave more than you think you need. Not only can you cut it away later, but as long as your paper hexagons are all the same size, we can be a little bit sloppy with the cutting of our fabric, and it's kind of nice to have that wiggle room.
Something to consider if you're using a patterned fabric is how to position your hexagons. If you take a close look at these hexagons here, they have been positioned in such a way that the pattern from the fabric makes a bigger pattern when put together. Some people like to be orderly. Some people like a more loose or joyful approach. You may want a solid flower or something with a solid center and patterned petals.
It's totally up to you. It's your project. Okie dokie artichokes. We've got paper hexagons. We've got our fabric hexagons with our preferred seam allowance. It's time to baste. No, not like a turkey. In sewing, basting means using large stitches to hold something together temporarily. By the way, I'm going to assume that you know how to tie a knot and thread your needle and tie off at the end. If you don't, you can always go back and check out my first video for some tips and tricks. All right, it works like this.
You take your fabric hexagon and hold the paper hexagon in the middle of it, paper facing you. Start by folding one edge of the fabric over the side of the paper, finger pressing the fabric over the edge of the paper, and you're going to put your needle through from the folded side to the flat side. Now, I apologize if I get this wrong or backwards down the line in this video. In general, the folded side will be the back side and the flat will be the front side, since it will end up being the face of the project. Anyway, you've got your thread coming out of the flat side. Turn the hexagon so that the next side over is facing up, and fold that side down, making sure to keep the first folded side totally flat. This part is kind of tricky. I then like to bring my needle back through from the flat side of the next fold and then go back through on the other side so that the thread kind of holds down the edge of the folded fabric here. You'll keep folding, turning, and stitching until you get back to your knot. Then you'll tie off, cut your thread, and start on the next one. The front should look something like this. You'll continue to do this for all 14 of your hexagons.
This is going to take you a while. In fact, I made a time-lapse video of me sewing up all of my hexagons so that you can see just how much work it is.
So I'm starting off by basting my hexagons, and I just poked myself in the finger with my needle. That happens to me on a fairly regular basis. Your skin gets a little bit thicker, but also if you're the one holding the needle and you accidentally poke yourself in the finger with it, you're not going to keep poking. So don't worry, you're not going to get too hurt, but also don't be surprised if you accidentally get a little, oh, there we go. Nice front and back. So don't be afraid if you poke yourself, you're not alone. You're not alone at all. So the fabric that I am working with right now is the sort of tie-dyed multicolor batik fabric. So it doesn't really matter if the pattern is centered because there's not really a pattern to it that I need to follow. So I'm just kind of, working along. That's what my face looks like when I'm concentrating. Great to know. And you can see that white ribbon that is pinned to my jacket there is where my scissors are. And you can see I kind of pick them up and use them every once in a while. I like to keep them close at hand. It's actually quicker than setting them on a table. I can just sort of grab the ribbon, and there at the end are my scissors. It also prevents them from, getting played with by my cats. Okay, so now for this is the black fabric with the tan pattern on it, and I wanted to be very specific in how that fabric came together for the finished product. So I'm using the light coming through the window that's directly next to me to sort of position the hexagon of paper on the fabric hexagon. So I'm kind of holding the paper behind it and holding it up, making sure that what I want is perfectly centered. And so that's a trick that you can use at home. It can be a window, it can be a lamp, a ceiling light, kind of whatever you want. Now this whole process took me about 35 minutes, but I've been doing it for a while. And, when I was doing it at Prairie, it might take me a whole morning to cut and assemble one flower, but that's because I kept getting interrupted and getting stopped by guests and explaining what I was doing, which I love to do. So, if it takes you a little bit longer, that's totally fine. Don't feel bad about it. If you're working on a larger project where you're going to be basting a lot of hexagons, you can cut them all out and baste them all at the same time, or you can baste just enough to make a flower, put them together, and then move on.
The next part is sewing the hexagons together. Now, You have several choices for thread when you do this. If you pick something similar to the colors in your fabric, you won't be able to see the thread quite as much. If you pick something that's really different, like if you've got black and you're using white thread, you'll be able to see your stitches, but maybe you want to, and that's okay.
Once you've chosen your thread, you'll take 2 hexagons and hold them front side in so that the fabric is like the peanut butter and jelly on a sandwich. You can tie a knot in your thread or just do a couple of small stitches in the same place, which will serve as an anchor. Doing this same place or back stitching has the added bonus that it's harder to lose or accidentally cut off than a knot. If you lose the knot, the stitching will come out. Once you've got your thread anchored, you're going to do some very small whip stitching down the length of the side. You want your stitches to be as close to the edges as possible so that when you open it up later, your hexagons will lay flat. You might feel some resistance, and that will be the paper. You can absolutely sew right through it. Here are some hexagons I've used, and you can see how the needle punched through along the edge. Once you get to the end of where those 2 hexagons join, you can do another couple of stitches in place to anchor the end, and then cut your thread. Don't go around the corner.
Now, you might notice that my stitches are really small, but that's because I am really particular about my sewing. And in fact, I've been doing this for about 9 years. So if your stitches don't look as tiny or as evenly spaced as mine, don't worry. You're just beginning, and that is fantastic.
A couple of notes about fabric placement. If you're being picky about your pattern, you want to watch carefully how you're assembling everything. But if you mess up, guess what? You can snip your thread and start again. Fabric is great because holes made by needle and thread are only temporary and can be fixed. Yay! When you start to add your 3rd hexagon to the first 2, make sure it's lined up the way you want, and then start sewing from one corner and sew that seam just like the first one. When you get to the edge where it is going to join up with another hexagon, just put a couple of anchoring stitches right there if you'd like, and then simply open it up, turn, and fold like so. Bending the paper won't hurt it, and in fact it helps if the paper is more pliable when it's time to pull it out. Continue adding petals to the flower until you have all 7 combined. Repeat the process for your second flower. Looks good! For our project, we need the outside edges of all the hexagons to stay stable, so we aren't going to remove the paper just yet. The one exception is the middle hexagon. It's already stitched down on all 6 sides. It's as stable as can be. We can snip the basting stitches, pull them out, and then gently remove the paper. If your paper isn't horribly ripped, you can use it again. What a beautiful flower! I like to keep my paper hexagons organized by putting them on a string like this. I just thread the needle with the end of the holding thread whenever I need to add more. It also works for hexagon organization for bigger projects.
Now is the time we're going to take those 2 flowers and combine them to make our pincushion.
To do this, you'll take your 2 hexagon flowers and place them face in. You're going to do the same whip stitch you used to attach the hexagons to each other, but this time you'll be going all the way around the outside like this. Now make sure that you don't actually sew it entirely closed though. If you start at an outside point like this, we want to leave an indent area where 2 hexagons meet and leave it open. Once you've gone around, leaving your opening, we can cut the basting stitches and remove the paper, yes, even the ones that aren't totally sewn up yet. They should be stable enough that they won't go completely wild on you. Don't forget to add them to your string if you want.
So, now that it's paper free, we're going to turn it right side out. Just kind of push it through the hole. You'll have some little threads and stuff hanging out. You can just pull those through. Now you can use like a pencil or a bamboo skewer or something to help you push out the corners. Just try not to use the pointy end because if you do, it might poke through those seams you just spent so much time sewing. This might take a little bit. Now to stuff. Now maybe like me, you've been going through your house and you find like a pillow that you don't really want anymore, so maybe you're gonna give it to Goodwill or something. Well, guess what? It has a new use. You can just cut this pillow open and reuse the stuffing. If you don't have any old pillows that you want to reuse, you can use fabric scraps. You might even have some left over from this project, or maybe even some yarn. If you have like old t-shirts that you're not gonna wear anymore, you can even cut that up into bits and put it in. Now you don't want the pieces to be too big or they're not gonna get into the corners of that pincushion. So just use your stuffing of choice and get it right on in there. Now you want to make sure that you're not overstuffing your pincushion. You do want to take small chunks at a time and kind of work it into each little arm of your or petal of your flower there. But you also want to make sure that you're not overstuffing it. I mean, after all, those seams are hanging on by a thread. Yeah, okay, I know it's not that funny, but I got my sense of humor from my dad, so you can even use your little pencil buddy or helper to kind of direct that stuffing where you want it to go. If this were one of those stores where you get to make your own stuffed animal, you'd want to make your, it's like getting all of the stuffing in like the legs and the arms and stuff, you know, and you can have it softer or firmer on depending on your liking, but you want to make sure that you really get it like all the way in there. All right, once it's all stuffed up to your liking, we're going to work on sewing up that final seam. So once it's all stuffed, we're going to sew up this final seam. I'm going to recommend just kind of holding it closed with one hand, and with your needle and thread, just whip stitching it closed. And you can just kind of pinch it as you go along. You can do the same kind of whip stitching that you did when you were sewing your hexagons together. Just make sure your knot is secure and ta-da! Pincushion! Beautiful! Now that you've got the hang of it, you can make more pincushions, or maybe it's a pillow for a doll or a toy for your cat. It's up to you. Now before you go, I would like to share a little bit of earned wisdom with you. That is wisdom that I have picked up over my time of creating my own pincushions and using pincushions a lot. Now, pins, they can hang out in a pincushion like this. You can sort of see them sticking up because they have this nice round part of the top called the head of the pin. That prevents it from going all the way through the fabric. You can see I can push and push and push. It ain't going all the way through. Needles, however, have no head. They only have an eye. And so they are capable of going all the way through our fabric. And thank goodness, because without that ability, we wouldn't be able to sew. But it can be dangerous if you are having needles in your pincushion, because somehow they might get lost in the inner workings of your pincushion, and then someday you might go to pick it up and accidentally find yourself stabbed with a needle, and also your needles might all disappear. Nobody likes that. So while it's okay for your pins to kind of stick straight up like that, one of the things I like to do with my needles to make sure that I don't lose them is to put them sideways through one of the petals like this. So they're kind of sticking sideways like that. And that way I won't lose them. I know exactly where they are. I know exactly where the point of my needle is, and I am safe. Now you always have to have caution when you're picking up a pincushion, because there's always the possibility that if you squeeze too hard, you're gonna get a little bit poked. But I trust all of you to be safe with your pincushions. Thank you for joining me for this installment of Sew with Po. I hope you have a great day and are enjoying Conner Prairie at home.